Welcome, everybody, to episode 91 of Puppet Masters and Castle Freaks, the internet's leading all things Charles Band podcast. I am one of your hosts, Jared Hornbeck, a real bad apple who's got my ass in a sling, Mother Goose. But I'm not the only person here who's got their ass in a sling. No, I'm not. Who else is here with me?
Well, it is me, Steve Guntley, reminding you once again that this podcast takes place in the imagination of a 15-year-old boy. This is the podcast about Stardog Van Halen, Don Glover's Vid Peep, and a pet raccoon named Zeke. That's because this is the podcast about Deadly Weapon, a classic tale of boy meets ray gun that may feel a little familiar to Full Moon Empire Charles Band diehards. We will get into exactly why that is. But first of all, we have a Deadly Weapon of our own here, a very special guest joining us to talk about this movie. Who is joining us today?
Well, we do have a special guest here, so I'm very happy to have this person on here because they do have some really cool news about a project that they're working on that they'll get to later on when they plug. But more than that, this is a friend, this is a trivia teammate, someone who I get to talk about horror movies with all the time, and I'm excited because now I get to talk about something that's not quite a horror movie, but something that he brought to our attention. Our guest today is Mike Cucinotta. Mike, what's up, man? Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely.
I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be here joining you sometimes between Wednesday and Friday, as the movie would say.
Yes. Sometime between late Wednesday and early Friday.
Between Wednesday.
I cannot be certain. Like time feels like very irregular right now, so I cannot be certain exactly what the time that actually is.
Yeah.
So for anyone who doesn't know, Mike is a big horror movie guy. I mean, I know you, Mike, as a member of, I would say a member of one of my trivia teammates and then a rival on another trivia teammate.
Sometimes
on another
a rival.
Team, sometimes a rival. But you have a long, storied history, so I guess it would only make sense that we kind of introduce you the same way we do with first-time guests. Tell us a little bit about your history with horror, B-movies, sci-fi, stuff like that, because just from knowing you, I'm sure, you know, you were around very similar in age. You were a video store kid as well. So tell us a little bit about how you first discovered it and what got you hooked.
I got into horror. I mean, I can think back early childhood. I think the first thing I remember people talking about was Poltergeist, and I had to get my eyes on it. So that was probably my biggest introduction, my first introduction to horror. But then later you get into your teenage years, and I was right at the right age for USA Up All Night. Which is, you know, certainly where I got introduced to a lot of the Charles Band movies. They showed plenty of them. Just growing up in the 80s, you got all the icons of the 80s, you know, just like dripping through the pop culture, Freddy, Jason, and you wanted to see every one of them. Video stores were huge at the time. We got a VCR late, so it was more taping off of network TV, watching local TV, having their horror movie week. I don't know, Jared, if you grew up in New York, if you remember, Channel 5 would have an entire week of just Friday the 13th movies, which is crazy to think about. Cut to pieces. Watching those, getting 3D glasses from 7-Eleven for Friday the 13th Part 3 or The Mad Magician. And then it just, it grew into, it really just, incubated my love for the genre. And growing up, with cable TV in the 90s, where again you'd see a lot of the Charlie Band movies and a lot of B movies were all over the place. They had a lot of time to fill, and that led into going to conventions and starting to meet your icons and meet your heroes, which led to a website I founded in the early aughts, 2004, called Icons of Fright, where we just did these like long form interviews, kind of what a podcast would be now, but all in print. We'd sit down with a horror star for an hour or two and record it and transcribe it, publish it, and we did that we're celebrating our 20th anniversary. We haven't had the website live for a few years, but that's leading into the project that we'll talk about, the book, the Icons of Fright book.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. Very excited to get into that. Mike, it's funny too, because as a New Yorker, I think Channel 5, of course, but then we've had it brought up, I think, a couple times on Mike, and I always see people with a shirt that I have for it, which was WPIX's Shocktober.
Shocktober. Yes, absolutely. Shocktober. They would show all the Carpenter movies. The Fog was a regular, and they would show those on the air. I mean, it would go from they were summer evening, but it was weekend afternoons. You'd have just hours and hours of Carpenter. Probably some of the I think they did some of the Hammer movies and a lot of like I remember seeing Vamp for the first time on Pix. Always presented in the last 15 minutes without commercial interruption.
Yeah, that's true. That
Which
was
was awesome.
was their one of their selling points, which was great. But I remember like from Shocktober specifically, I feel like I had seen the first Poltergeist already, but I definitely saw Poltergeist 2 for the first time during that because I remember being introduced to Reverend Kane that way and thinking he was in the commercial, he was in the promo ads, and being like, that guy's terrifying.
Terrible.
Yeah. So was Deadly Weapon a movie that was in your rotation when you were earlier because we're younger? Because this one is obscure even for like Empire movies. This one's kind of been lost to time in a big way.
Right. No, this came up. So they must have run this on HBO in like the afternoon during maybe the summer of 1990. I've never seen the entire film until this week. I would always catch it in the middle, which is what happened all the time when you pop into these movies. You just catch the middle. I remember catching Rodney Eastman because he was a big Nightmare on Elm Street fan. I'd pop on HBO. There he would be. It's the only other thing I remember him in at the time. And I remember looking it up just a few weeks ago when we spoke, Jared. I looked up Deadly Weapon. It came to my head. What was this movie? First of all, finding this movie is difficult. I kept thinking Perfect Weapon or something like that. It took a minute. And then I realized I saw on the Wikipedia page that it was a Charlie Band production. And I mentioned it to Jared. I said, "Are you ever going to do Deadly Weapon?" And that's when he said, "Well, maybe you should. Would you like to come on and do it?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. All right, we'll talk about it."
Finally give you an excuse to like finish the movie. I had that like with
I did watch
Red
the whole thing.
Yeah. I for whatever reason I saw because my history teacher in high school, whenever he didn't have a curriculum, he would put on Red Dawn. So I've seen the first half of that movie maybe like a dozen times, and I only just finished it like last year. I'm like, oh wow, I did not know how this movie ended. I did not realize most of them die.
And Mike, it's interesting.
Oh, I know. I've never seen that.
You brought up Perfect Weapon because that's going to be our introductory episode for our Jeff Speakman Patreon podcast.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have to do
that entire career in there.
It's going to be called Speak and Speakman. And it's going to be the hugest hit of all time. Speaking of the hugest hit of all time, let's talk about Deadly Weapon. This was released August 15th, 1989. It's written and directed by Michael Miner, and it stars Rodney Eastman, Kim Walker, Gary Frank, Michael Horse, Susan Blue, Tom Sassano, Ed Corbett, Richard Stephen Horowitz, Sasha Jensen, and William Sanderson. So it's time for another episode of Lost Empire Theater. I think listeners to our show are probably familiar with this dance by now. Empire acquired this movie. They put it out for a very limited theatrical release before pushing it hard on VHS. And then when Empire collapsed in 1989, the rights all subverted to MGM, who eventually would have their own bankruptcy and financial issues, which means that the rights to this thing are in the wind. For whatever reason, this was released on VHS and Laserdisc in the States, but it never got a DVD release in the US. The only place it did get a DVD release, weirdly, is the Netherlands. So there you go. That's where you need to go if you want to get your Deadly Weapon on VHS. I imagine it's probably just a ripped like version of the VHS. So it's probably about the same quality.
Sure.
But yeah, just one of those movies that sort of fell through the cracks when the companies sort of broke out and never really escaped VHS. That being said, this movie did actually get a little bit of a warmer critical reception than a lot of bands' productions at the time, in that critics saw it and wrote about it. Like a lot of the time, even back then, they're just like, oh yeah, we don't need to bother looking at this thing. But no, critics saw it and they praised it for being a surprisingly sensitive film and handling topics of like teen alienation and bullying and suicide with maybe a little more grace than you might expect. And Rodney Eastman actually got a Saturn nomination for Best Young Performance by an Actor. So
it's so funny to hear this movie talked about as being more sensitive and to hear that some critics were warm to it. Because I'll tell you something, David J., our friend of the show, David J, author of It Came from the Video Aisle and Empire of the Beast, he fucking hates this movie.
Yeah,
He
does it
hates
reference
this
an Empire of the Beast?
movie with a passion. And it's kind of crazy because like and a movie you'll hear us talk about in a couple of weeks, Enemy Territory, which is sort of another forgotten Empire movie he loves and has a lot of nice things to say. I will say, like, we all have that thing, right? We all have something we have kind of like an unnecessarily like livid feeling towards. Like we all have that thing, whatever that thing is in pop culture, where it just rubs us the wrong way, and it's like people like it, and then I guess when people like it, that makes it worse. It's like we all have something that we
that's
have.
me. Football, yeah. That's just the whole concept of football. That's me. Yeah.
Well, and I feel like this is where he is just taking out all his vitriol on this movie. Like it's funny because Rodney Eastman was nominated for a Saturn Award, and it's funny that even in this movie he doesn't have a ton of dialogue. Like he has narration, and then he has a bit of dialogue here and there. But I mean, he's someone we're used to seeing not really talking a whole lot. I mean, he has more lines in Nightmare 4. But really, it's a lot of expressiveness from him, and there's a lot of facial acting and stuff like that. David J, I think maybe like Rodney Eastman like banged his wife or something.
Oh wow, he's just really ripping him.
Oh,
he really rips into him. Like he's like this from frame one. You hate this character, you hate this performance. He's so like whiny and annoying, and it's like, I don't know, man. Like this movie is basically Laser Blast 2. And if you've seen Laser Blast 1, which we'll cover eventually down the line on the show, I find like Kim Milford's teenage protagonist in Laser Blast to be more annoying than I find Rodney Eastman in this movie.
I was having kind of the opposite reaction where I was just like, I don't understand why everybody seems to hate this kid so much. Like this is just kind of a normal teenage kid. He's pretty quiet. He doesn't really mess with anybody, but his parents hate him. Everybody around him just like hates his guts, and it seems like Dave J is on that boat. So.
Even the school nerd that you have your classic school nerd in Lester in this, who would really normally be the character that everyone's beating up on, and he's beating up on Zeke as well. Just everybody hates him, and he's just this normal, sensitive teenager. I think maybe if they had played up more that he was I think he's like supposed to be a metalhead kid. He's got the Led Zeppelin t-shirt eventually in the movie.
Yeah, he'd be hanging out.
But his identity just kind of isn't quite clear. Like, where does he fit in the high school society? He's
within our show, he'd fit in. He'd be friends with the kid from Dream Maniac.
Oh yeah,
sure. They'd be trading Led Zeppelin and Def Leppard shirts.
Yeah.
I don't do this very often, but I want to pull a direct quote from Empire of the Bees. About this. So fault number one of this movie, according to David J, as with Laser Blast before it, where is it? As played by Elm Street 3 and 4's Rodney Eastman, who is so freaking doom-laden and unlikable that you'll swiftly find yourself willing the U.S. Marshal Forces to move in and kneecap the gloomy bitch.
Wow. Oh, man, coming hard for Rodney Eastman. All right. I mean, that's interesting to discuss. I mean, yeah, like we've mentioned, this is kind of a starring vehicle for Rodney Eastman, who we only really knew prior to this as Joey, appearing in Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and 4, one of the few characters that does bridge more than one movie.
Oh, he's not like a bad guy number 3 in the remake of I Spit on Your Grave to You.
Oh yeah, usually that's what I think of immediately. I was looking up what he's been up to lately. Apparently, he's in a band with John Hawkes, which is awesome. Yeah, they're a band called King Straggler, and they're still playing to this day. Some other cast to mention here: we have Kim Walker, the late great Kim Walker, sadly best known as one of the Heathers, and she unfortunately died in 2001 of a brain tumor, which is very sad. We get a couple of other people here. Richard Stephen Horvitz, the aforementioned Lester. I know him best as a voice actor. He is Invader Zim on a Nickelodeon show. He's in the Psychonauts video games. He's got a very distinctive voice. We have beloved character actor William Sanderson from Blade Runner, Deadwood, Sasha Jensen from Dazed and Confused, and Gary Frank.
And Halloween 4.
And Halloween 4, and the Buffy movie. Yeah, obviously in that. But we are going to see, and Gary Frank, we are going to be seeing in another Empire film that we're going to talk about in a couple weeks called Enemy Territory. Now, the director here is interesting, too. The director here is Michael Miner, who had previously only directed one little short film and a couple of music videos for an LA-based rock group called Y&T. But his big claim to fame is that he is one of the co-writers of maybe the best American film ever made, 1987's RoboCop. Yes, so this is the sole directorial effort from the writer of RoboCop. Pretty amazing. Most of his credits since this have just been RoboCop related, although he did write the scripts to the sequels to both Lawnmower Man and Anaconda. So he took us on the hunt for the Blood Orchid. Yeah. He's the one.
And I take some umbrage, Steve, with your cast list. I'm going to ask in the future that if we're ever in a situation like this again, please do not leave out the unspoken hero of the Dick Ebersol SNL era, Gary Kroger.
Oh, forgive me. Yes, absolutely. Who could forget?
Or Frank Fontana from Murphy Brown himself, Joe Regalabuto.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, he does pop.
And Mort Seinfeld. Yeah,
Mort Seinfeld. Yeah.
I will
and
say,
Tina's mom from Friday the 13th 7. Susan Blue shows up.
There you go.
You know, it's funny.
Yeah.
That bothered me all the way until I went back and I was like, maybe I'm not going to rewatch the whole movie, but I'm going to go back to the same YouTube stream that I watched this on, which is the only way we were able to find this movie.
Yes.
And I went back and I watched maybe the second half of it again earlier today. And when his mom shows up, I'm like, that lady with that lion mane of hair, where is she from?
Hairdo, man. The same hairdo.
Was that
She must have walked right off the set.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh God, Susan Blue, who she was in something she gave this incredible performance. And I'm trying to remember what it was. I'll pull it later, but yeah, she has popped up in a few things like that, and she is definitely the mom from Friday 7.
Who's also a prolific voice actor. She's done Transformers, My Little Pony, and she's got a list of credits a mile long in voice acting.
That could be how I know her name. Yeah, she's definitely done a lot of like Scooby-Doo and like most 80s cheapy cartoon TV shows. So yeah, we should talk about the big elephantine alien in the room. You know, this is a very, very similar movie to one of Charles Band's earliest hits, 1976 film called LASERBLAST. All right, we have not covered it on the show yet. We will down the line, but it's a fairly well-known movie, even if that's only as an episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000 from kind of the heyday of the show. I think it was the first Charles Band film to appear on that show. And that's just a great episode.
Have you stricken Robot Holocaust from your mind, Steve?
Oh no! Did Robot Holocaust come before?
Yeah, Robot Holocaust is like one of the like first or second season episodes.
Oh, okay.
It's really, really early.
I don't know why I thought that one was like a much later one. Yeah, I thought that was like a reboot episode, but no. Okay. Yeah, I need to revisit. I don't think I've actually watched that episode of MST3K yet, the Robot Holocaust one. I've only experienced Robot Holocaust in its purest form.
The way God intended.
Yes, drip fed into my eyes. But yeah, so this is very similar to LASERBLAST, and that's not a coincidence. This was in its initial pitch going to be a sequel to LASERBLAST that came out 10 years later. So that fell apart. I think there were lots of weird rights issues because that was like from Charles Band Productions days, and this is Empire. And like, I think there were a lot of rights changing hands during those times. So they couldn't make it a direct sequel to LASERBLAST. Ultimately, it became kind of like a spiritual remake, you know, like it remains very, very similar. Like the weapon isn't an alien origin, but it is still like a deadly weapon. Yeah.
Oh, we've arrived at a title.
We've arrived at the title. There you say the title, win the movie. Yeah, that's the thing. This is also definitely
certainly for LASERBLAST. The first 20 minutes feel more solidly in LASERBLAST. Then it goes, but we'll talk about that. It gets a little weird.
That's kind of the interesting pitch. It's like in the middle of the movie, it stops being like an alien rampage. You know, so the kind of the crux of LASERBLAST is that he's got this weapon that makes him all powerful, but it's corrupting him. Right. You know, it's turning him into this like vicious creature. In this case, like the kid gets this very powerful government weapon that's been tested in the secret lab, and it makes him exert his power again after being horribly, viciously bullied for a really long time. And then it becomes like a weird siege movie where he ends up taking like a lot of members of the town hostage in like the local cafe, and it becomes a standoff with the military who are trying to get their weapon back. So that's kind of an interesting way of mixing up the formula here. But as far as like kind of where I came down on the movie, I don't think I'm quite as vitriolic, but I think I am a little closer to Dave J's reading of this, and if only because this is like a genuinely nasty movie, in a way that's like a little off-putting. You know,
right.
like,
At least in Laser Blast, you get some little cute Dave Allen aliens.
mhm.
You know, there's that whole fun like alien spaceship stop motion. They look like kind of little dinosaur aliens
Right.
talking to each other, and it's like the tone of Laser Blast is silly. I mean, this movie, it gets pretty dark, and like Laser Blast has just got like Eddie Deason running around, and like,
Right.
you know, I mean, that's gonna obviously lighten the tone of something like that. And then even, you know, there's some silly stuff like when he uses the ray gun to blow up the Star Wars billboard,
Yeah.
and stuff like that. I mean, it's kind of like tongue in cheek. Interestingly, there's a weird connection here to where like Kim Walker, this is like the second movie probably in a 9-month stretch that she filmed that dealt with teenage suicide
Yeah.
in kind of a
Interesting.
weird way. Like, she's definitely getting pigeonholed into like that. I like to think that this is in the same universe where, you know, they're having that newscast about teenage suicide, and the number one song in the country at the time is Teenage Suicide by Big Fun.
Yes,
it is
of course. Yeah. Now, there's one other interesting thing that this movie does, and you know, I'm curious where this sits with you guys. I think right in the beginning, they established that this movie takes place in the imagination of a 15-year-old boy. Okay, so are we kind of meant to believe that this is like the power trip for like a bullied teen? Are we meant to interpret that the bullying that he's seeing and experiencing in this movie is exaggerated because like this is just what it feels like? Because it is, the bullying is kind of ghoulish in this movie, like from every angle.
Everyone.
You know, everyone picks on him. His teacher like slams him when he reads his story and sends him to the principal's office, where the principal physically assaults him and calls him a slur, and then he gets beat up 6 times on his way home, and then his drunken dad beats the shit out of his whole room and kills his dog with a bat.
That is the single
shocking. One of the most shocking
that might
things
be
I've
the
seen
single
in a movie,
most
in one of these movies.
upsetting image we've had in the thing we've covered so far. Like, as soon as that moment happened, I was like, wasn't prepared for it. And
No.
you know, like anyone else, I'm very sensitive to like animal cruelty on screen. And there's something about, I mean, it's obviously not a real dog. And I think they kind of, you know, they do the No Country for Old Men thing where it's kind of shot in a way where it's kind of in your face how not a real dog it is, which is fine. But it's the nature in which the shot is framed and the dog goes flying into the corner and the streak of blood shoots up into his face is really upsetting.
And just with this dog being the one thing in the world that this kid has, like the one thing in the world that loves him, and to die so horribly, it was genuinely upsetting. So like at the very least, I was on the kid's side for the rest of the movie, because it's like, yeah, the same way that like, I don't know, it's you sympathize with what he's going through.
Well, he's going to have to get
horrible.
He's going to have to get a replacement dog now named Van Hagar.
There you go. Yeah, he's got to get a big red Irish setter or something. But I mean, but all of this is still kind of thrown into relief for me because of the whole imagination of a teenage boy thing. Like, is this just like a teenage persecution complex? In which case, that's kind of a gross movie to be in. I don't know. Like, it's just kind of a weird headspace to be in. I'm just wondering if it's a mistake to say early on that this is in this kid's imagination.
I think because it does get kind of strange towards the middle. Things get very surreal when we get to the cafe or the arcade where everyone's being held hostage. It's a very strangely loose hostage situation. If you remember, he's got a few people tied up, but we've also got Georgie and his wrecking crew just kind of wandering in and out, and it just feels very dreamy. And I was
Yeah.
wondering, is this going to end up is this kid going to wake up? Is this going to be like an Invaders from Mars situation where we're really, in a dream or in a fantasy, which of course it doesn't turn out to be. We don't know. But
It's still kind
and
of
it starts to
ambiguous.
feel like ambiguous. It's sort of playing with whether or not we are in his imagination. Not playing with it, or if it's handling it adeptly or not. But it feels off. There's something about the tone that feels off, especially in that situation, the hostage situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was watching the movie and I had the same thought at the end where I was like, okay, this is kind of ambiguous because if you're looking at what we've seen as the audience, it's
Mhm.
like, okay, there was this standoff and the government killed him and said, we're going to make it look like a suicide because this is clearly someone who's not all there and kind of suicidal to begin
Right.
with. We have to put like a trigger warning at the beginning of this episode, probably before we release. I feel like this is the most we've discussed this.
Yeah, I mean, and the movie is living with it too. Yeah, the movie is like confronting a lot of these issues, and I don't
Yeah.
know if I agree that it's sensitively handled, but I do think it's
Well, it's hard to tell, and that's why
unflinching.
when it got to the end of the movie, I was like, all right, before the last like scene or two, I was wondering if we were going to get sort of a reveal that it was clearly a suicide and that it was clearly not actual events that took
Right.
place. But then the way the movie plays it, it doesn't feel that way. Now, I'm not so like I've seen the movie Carrie many times. I've never read the book Carrie.
Mhm.
So an interesting component of that, if you're talking about high school bullying, is I've always had this thing where when I've watched De Palma's Carrie, I've had conversations with people before where they talk about the prom scene, and it's like, okay, the prom scene is presented in a way where it's the manifestation of all of what she's been feeling, but in that exact moment, it isn't that all of the people are laughing at her. It's that she's harnessing what her mom told her was going to happen and
Mhm.
how she's receiving that moment. And so, I mean, like John Travolta and Nancy Allen are outside of the gym. Sue
Mhm.
Snell or Amy Irving is trying to prevent it from happening. Betty Buckley, I mean, maybe Sidney Lassick, he's kind of an asshole in that movie, but like
A little bit.
Betty Buckley is really on Carrie's side for a lot of that movie. So maybe PJ Souls would be the only person actually laughing in that scene, but it plays where everyone starts laughing. And I wonder if that's what they're kind of trying to do here, although not handled with so much nuance, like definitely broader. But I had the same thing. I was wondering if we were going to get some kind of definitive thing about this truly being all in his imagination, or is it that
Right.
he was just such an expendable member of society that they were so easily able to be like, oh no, he killed himself, like you knew it was going to happen. And
Yeah.
it's because it's a B movie and maybe not handled in the most how should I say this, sensitive, thoughtful kind of way. It's an ambiguity that I don't know if is purposeful.
Right. It becomes that frustrating thing of like, I appreciate that the director tried to inject a little stakes, a little real world commentary, a little bit of like a serious like emotional beat into this piece of genre fiction, but they didn't really seem equipped to fully commit to it. They're not really. I don't know. They're writing this line in a weird way where I'm kind of just left with like, I don't know what they're intending.
Well, nobody ever feels like they're in any danger. His hostages aren't in any real danger. They're wrapped up with the wires from a pinball machine. And if you
Yeah.
can just wander in and out of the cafe, I mean, what's going on? It's also, there's something strange about the way he collects his hostages, which is fitting all four or five people in the trunk of a car. It's weird. It's not real. This is funny because this movie declares it's in the imagination of a boy, and then I don't know if it just doesn't seem to deliver on that. Ultimately, it's never, there's never any suspense. I mean, the army's gathering around, but they even seem to, a lot of them seem to be on his side, which is interesting. They're really kind of rooting for him not to do something that requires them to kill him.
Yeah.
And so you're never sure what's, it always feels like he's going to pull it off.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know. I'm weirdly struggling to wrap my head around this movie in a way, which is fairly straightforward in its execution. But I think just that one element of it really kind of throws everything into contrast, because there's an interesting idea here of like this being in this revenge fantasy, right? Of like this kid who's been pushed way too far, and he's having this very outlandish revenge fantasy, a la like Heavenly Creatures or something, where real world and science fiction are kind of melding together. But the movie is equivocating. It's like I'm still not clear if this ray gun actually exists or if this is just all in this kid's imagination.
Right. And also, I mean, Heather number one goes from not knowing who he is to pitying him to being into him real fast.
Yeah. Which again feels like it feels like an adolescent fantasy, right? Like if I can just show this girl how big and tough I am, she'll finally notice who I am. Like it all kind of plays like that. But then we do spend a lot of time with these military characters, and we do spend a lot of time with like all these tertiary like bureaucrats that are all kind of trying to get their hands on the weapons. So you do feel like there is some reality to it here. But then you also get moments like where the mother shows up, and in a moment of just ridiculous cruelty, like the first thing out of her mouth is just like, I just want to make it clear, I do not care about him. Which is something which feels like an internal voice of like an abandoned child, like talking to himself. Yeah. And you do have to love that. Like I was cheering a little bit when like the bureaucrat guy just like hauled off and smacked her in the face. Like she was being so ridiculously, needlessly cruel. The kid wasn't even there. And
that could also be an element of fantasy. Maybe he's imagining this happening because, I mean, he calls his mother on a payphone. She tells him, do not come come to me. I don't want to see you. And then she does show up. When she shows up, she's already been she's been brought by the military to their field headquarters. She's in her waitress uniform, and it's like immediately I didn't know who she was. It takes you a second or two to understand that this is Zeke's mother. But then you're right, they're telling her you've got to help your son, you got to do this, and she's getting kind of beat up by the military guys. Is he imagining that too? Is this also going on in Zeke's head somewhere in his fantasy?
I kind of like the idea that this isn't a movie that's been like analyzed to death. Like it's a hard to find movie. It's a pretty obscure movie. YouTube comments were people saying, I thought this movie was a fever dream. I remember seeing it on HBO when I was 10 years old, and I've been looking for it for 30 years. And finally here it is. I kind of feel like we have the freedom within this episode right now to kind of make the canon of this movie. Like
there we
go.
I
kind of feel like wherever we land on this is going to be official canon, because there really isn't anybody out there dissecting this movie to my knowledge and having this kind of conversation, because to me, like everything felt so heightened and kind of like everyone felt kind of like caricatures. And I don't know if that was being a byproduct of like, well, it's a cheap movie and a fast shoot and it's maybe hastily written quickly and we don't have a real ton of time to really flesh people out. I do like that we get upside down bully cam for a little while when he's getting his bike stolen.
Yeah.
We get the camera cut to his point of view, but the stepfather is like egregiously over the top drunk and violent, sending him out for whiskey and then like beating everything in his room, including his dog with a bat. Kim Walker kind of goes from like not knowing who he is to then wanting to leave the bully to be with him and then paint his face. And then there's a kind of hilarious exchange where they're just like sitting watching the stars and she's like, "You're a virgin, aren't you?" And he doesn't say anything. And then she's just kind of like, "Not for long." And she just rolls him over on top of her. And then like the way the other characters act with one another, even down to the kind of contentious relationship between Lieutenant Dalton, Gary Frank's character, and then the person we didn't really talk about, like the General Stone, who is played by Ed Nelson, kind of great old character actor who is the elusive Robert Denby from the Mystery Science Theater Riding with Death. And if you,
Oh, right.
which is something my brother and I used to quote to each other all the time.
Okay.
But
I didn't clock that.
There's a broadness to all of this. And again, I can't tell if it's broad because it's underdeveloped or if some of these things are intentional because there's an ambiguity that this movie wants the viewer to take away. And like you said, Steve, this has been one of those times where I'm kind of having a more difficult time wrapping my head around the intentionality of this film and what it's trying to say compared to what we're literally seeing.
And what's throwing me off too is the fact that he has flights of fancy that we see in the movie, right? Like he's narrating a short story to himself and he's imagining like a spaceship. So in the text of the movie, it's like those are the flights of fancy, but the movie seems to kind of posit that the entire film is a construction. So it just gets a little muddy. I think if I were to say, like, I want to say canonically that like this is all a teenage revenge fantasy because that makes it more interesting. I think it explains some of the histrionic plot turns in a way. It explains some of the power fantasy flexing that ultimately turns into martyrdom. You know, this is, I think this does very accurately capture what it feels like to be a moody 15-year-old boy who thinks everybody in the world hates him. But this view of like, this is okay. Think about this as like for listeners who suffer from anxiety, like I do. Like think of this as like an externalizing process, right? That's kind of the way that people talk about Zeke in this movie or talk to him straight to his face is the way that like people with anxiety's brains are happening. But if you heard somebody outside of your head talking to you like that, you would think it was hilarious, right? You would think it was completely over the top and ridiculous, and you wouldn't understand why somebody would say that. That's the vibe of the dialogue in this movie, which makes me feel like this is all kind of in his head. That's where I'm coming down.
Yeah, I'm not really sure where I land yet on this one. So if you're somebody who's listening right now and you have a reading of Deadly Weapon, or you know people who worked on the film, or you are Michael Miner, and you feel like you need to put your 2 cents in, please email us at puppetmasterscastlefreaks@gmail.com or leave us, a message on one of our social media platforms letting us know your thoughts on this movie, because this concept, I mean, this is one that they would go back to the well a few times on. I mean, like we've already said, this is essentially a more serious toned laser blast without little Dave Allen stop motion alien effects. But this would even become kind of a concept that would be recycled again about 10 years later for a David Dakota movie called Alien Arsenal. So this is just something that there's something intriguing about this concept, whether it is what would this put upon person do given these circumstances, or if it is some kind of weird revenge fantasy. It's something that Charles Band, through his different iterations, because now we would be talking about Charles Band Productions once, then an Empire picture once, then a Full Moon era movie, like kind of keeps coming back to that well here for these similar type stories.
Yeah. And
It made me think a lot when I was watching it. Is there another version of this movie? I mean, you mentioned Dakota's movie, which is wackier. Is there a version of this movie that could have been made with somebody else in the Empire, company? If this had been handled by, say, Beekler, who handled teenagers and teenage fantasy really well with Troll a couple of years ago, does it work a little better? Is it clearer? Or is Michael Miner just kind of a little bit out of his league? Here doesn't seem to really have a handle on what he wants the movie to be. I mean, if Dakota directed this, it would be another thing altogether. It would be completely off the rails. But is there another version of this movie that could have existed? Yeah, beefcake lasers.
Yeah, a lot more guys in tidy whities. Yeah.
Right. With the bully without the overalls and no shirt would just have no overalls, just a Speedo.
So that guy looked like, again, I'm making an extended universe here with Deadly Weapon, but that guy looked like, to me, he was the teenage version of who would grow into being Terrence Mann's bounty hunter in Critters.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely, yes.
I kept calling the guy from Queensryche. You look like the guy from Queensryche or something like that. This whole the town bullies are all over the place as well.
Oh yeah,
Some of them look a little jockey, and then you've got the guy with the long hair and no shirt and all the pecs.
Overalls
It
and
was just
no shirt is a
overalls,
choice.
overalls and no shirt. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Um,
Looked like
but I
they're
just
about
wondered
to
if
go
I
like
mean, this movie's also a play on something that was happening at the time too. This is the teenage nerd in trouble kind of movie. This movie also kind of recalls things like My Science Project and Real Genius, a little bit of maybe War Games,
yeah.
where they're handled a little more adeptly. So this feels like just the cheap version of that, or is it just not? Could there have been a better version of it with different hands?
Well, I
Yeah,
mean,
this is
RoboCop is a satire, and so
RoboCop is the satire, yeah.
you almost would think, I mean, maybe a very sort of snarky approach to, I mean, I don't want to assume that of what the intention was behind the script and the way that this movie was made, but then coming from somebody who would kind of use the television news and media in such a perverse way in RoboCop here, it's like, is this more sincere, or is there something beneath the surface here where there's even maybe some kind of meditation on the effects of like music and media on teenagers? I mean, again, we're constructing the curriculum of this movie right now as we go. So anything we say is canon from now on.
Is this the first movie to blame violence on video games? We see that he's obsessed with video games because it gives him a sense of control. Right. Are we making that argument now? Michael Miner says in interviews that he meant this primarily as an anti-gun movie. As like a way of like showing the devastation of violence and things like that. I think if that's true, I just feel like he might have jumped over the more interesting story, which is about like this alienated teen being pushed too far. This is a genre that I think probably rightly has largely gone away, especially in the wake of like so many school shootings and things like that. Like we live in a very different world than we did when this movie came out.
I never do this, but I'm going to quote from David J. twice, directly from a book this time.
Okay.
Which is, as we're dealing with Rodney Eastman as a character, he talks a little bit about how kind of he has these deep feelings and the world is screwed up. Thus, throughout the entirety of Deadly Weapon, Zeke narrates in the same self-absorbed fashion ad nauseum, viz., it's tough being a visitor from another planet because nobody ever understands. Well, boo fucking who, space boy. Earth's a bitch. Get used to it.
Oh my God. Yeah, the knives out in this one.
Why does he hate Zeke as much as everybody else in this movie does? I just didn't catch that. I felt bad for him.
I mean, is David J the bully in overalls?
David J is the bully, man.
Oh wow! I mean, I appreciate he had a strong reaction here, and I think this is a movie that does generate some strong reactions, even if a lot of mine are kind of confusion. I also think it's very strange that of all the movies to have this title, this is the one. It also seems to kind of doom it to get overlooked or forgotten because, like, you hear Deadly Weapon, you think this has got to be like a early Jean-Claude Van Damme movie or
right.
Michael Dudikoff, something like that. Like, it seems like a cheapy action movie and not like a strange sci-fi siege movie. Yeah, it's a hard film to describe. I think I need to sit with it for a little bit and just kind of like ponder my thoughts on it, because on one hand, I do appreciate that it seems to be a little bit more ambitious than a lot of other movies of this time, but I'm just not clear where that ambition is pointing,
Totally. Yeah, that's how I feel about this one. It's tough to say. It's like it kind of works as a reading of a revenge fantasy. It kind of works as like what happens when people like this fall through the cracks and like aren't considered, and like how easily he sort of overlooked and put upon by everyone in his life, and then just kind of like, removed like a stain, like a spot.
Yeah.
It's like, so I think there are some interesting the things at play here. Another interesting piece of note about this movie is that there is a UK variant of this movie that exists allegedly, which is super profane
Oh,
comparatively.
Okay.
Apparently, a lot of the dialogue was cleaned up for the US Trans World release of this movie.
oh, interesting.
And I guess some of the narration was changed around or taken out. But I don't really know what the reason for that is. But apparently, like a very the US version, which is presumably the one we've seen, has been cleaned up heavily in terms of language from a version that exists in the UK. I feel like that's the first time we've encountered something like that
It's probably
in a movie here.
This has got to have been targeted towards afternoon cable, which is where I first saw it. So this is for this to have an R rating or not be able to be shown, after 8 o'clock on HBO. This movie never works. The only way you get an audience for this is to get kids' eyes in front of it. It has to be like what is the final to do with the actual? Is there an actual MPA rating on this? It has to be a PG-13, right?
I think this is an R, right? Because
is it?
I don't know.
I think it's an R. Yeah, I think there's a couple of F bombs. I think that find their way through multiple different kinds of F bombs too.
Yeah.
By the way.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. No. So that's interesting. It's like it's the reverse of a video nasty. They're making the video nasty.
Is it possible they had to trim some of the violence down because the UK is funny about violence or funny about certain weapons on screen as well? Maybe just to amp that up. Yeah, but I guess we'll have a hard time finding that cut as much as we found even a stream of this movie. So.
Yeah, totally. And there's different overdubbings and stuff in it. It's just a very odd thing that we haven't really encountered. And we've said this many, many times, but it's like this is a movie I think that looks decent enough through some of it. It was shot by a guy named James L. Carter. He did some early De Palma stuff. And I think the budget for this one was slightly higher than it had been for the kind of budget that had been put aside for something like a Cellar Dweller, where there's a lot of creature effects, or something like Crawl Space, where you have to pay a lunatic like Klaus Kinski to be there and work. So there's a little bit more money. It's kind of skillfully shot in some ways. So we've come down on some of these movies where we've been like, this would be a good candidate for another Empire of Screams box set. Like, I don't know if I feel like I need to have this one in that kind of a box set, but I do think there's an interesting premise. There's an interesting cast. We all watch this from a VHS rip, so maybe would be nice to see this like pristinely cleaned up the way that they did with Robot Jocks or Dolls or Cellar Dweller or Arena, any of the movies in that first Empire Screams box, because I would like to see this looking pristine. And Mike, you mentioned before about how this is kind of like the perfect candidate for like an afternoon movie on HBO, and you're totally right. And we all have movies like this, but there's a real kind of shared hive mind of people commenting on YouTube about this, where that was how they saw it. And then as the years went by, they kind of talked themselves into thinking that this was a movie they made up. There seemed to be a lot of conversation happening. Like, I couldn't remember the name of this movie. I saw it on HBO in 1989 or 1990 or something like that. I remember this scene happening. I tried to explain it to a friend. They couldn't figure out what movie I was talking about. And then finally they stumbled upon it, and they were like thanking the person who put it on YouTube for, confirming that this movie did in fact exist and wasn't just a figment of their imagination. And I feel like that's happened to me a bunch, whether it be stuff I saw half asleep on Up All Night or stuff I saw on HBO in the middle of the day when I was sick. But I just have like scenes from movies randomly, and then it's a pretty great feeling when it's confirmed, like, oh no, that's a movie. Like, that's a movie that exists. And I feel like because a lot of people kind of felt that way about this one, it would be nice if it were slightly more readily available than the way that we had to track it down. And it's not even like a question of getting an 88 films release from the UK or something. Like you said, this is virtually impossible to find anywhere.
Like, I don't know
This
if
was
you
a
guys
fun
watched
movie.
this.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, the version I watched still had the blue screen of the TV, and it had like the
Yes.
play icon. Like, I was literally watching somebody pointing a camera at a VHS dub of this. So that's the quality that exists on YouTube. Sorry, Michael, I cut you off.
Oh no, this movie is fun if to restore it, just because everybody, we talked about all these actors that show up in this movie. Everyone's showing up in this movie 5 minutes before they're famous, or 5 seconds before they vanish into obscurity, and
Mm.
everybody feels like it feels like you're watching a movie just loaded with cameos. When Joe Regalbuto turns around, you're like, that's Frank from Murphy Brown. What is he doing in this thing? William Sanderson just shows up, and it's and Michael Horse. So I love Twin Peaks.
Oh yeah, we didn't even
Yeah.
say Michael Horse.
We didn't
Yeah,
talk about
yeah.
Indian Joe and what Indian Joe's purpose in this movie is, which I'm sure. I don't know if Indian Joe really exists.
There's a chance. Yeah, there's a chance he's a
There's a
figment. Yeah.
He only really seems to interact with Zeke, and I really couldn't understand most of his dialogue. He seems to be he's behind sunglasses. He's got the hat. I don't know what.
He's very poorly mixed. Yeah.
Very poorly mixed. Yeah.
No, you're
It's just
absolutely right.
that was cameo. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be nice to see some of these people like Joe Regalabuto or Gary Frank or, like I said, the SNL alum that nobody could possibly forget, Gary Kroger, as the Donald Glover.
Yeah,
Right,
a weird element to pop up into this movie. He's like the Robert Downey Jr. and Natural Born Killers of this movie. he pops up very late and like is just this media obsessed weirdo character. I don't know. It's a strange performance, a strange role.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
but
I
it's
wonder
a strange
if
movie.
it is a strange movie, and I wonder if like having both Brad Hall and Julia Louis Dreyfus in Troll was what led down the Gary Kroger pipeline.
Yeah,
for
Absolutely.
Charles Band.
Absolutely. Gary Kroger was part of the SNL season with Julie Louis-Dreyfus and Brad Hall, and they worked together on a comedy troupe together before they were on SNL together. That's another Seinfeld connection to this movie, in addition to Barney Martin.
Interesting. I did not realize he became he ran in the Democratic congressional primary in 2016 and ran for an Iowa State House in the 2016 election.
That's interesting.
Go
Didn't
Gary Kroger.
Gary Kroger, and then I always want to say in the few times that we've talked about Gary Frank, I always want to say Fred Grandy, who was Gopher in The Love Boat. I think he also moved on from acting into some kind of political position as well, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe that's true. Yeah. Because I remember that being a late night joke a lot, because Sonny Bono was going into politics around the same time, and people like, yeah. Anyway, before we go too far into that,
these are my favorite parts of episodes like this, is where we devolve into something that nobody under the age of 35 could possibly know or care about.
Kids, let me tell you about Melanie Hutzel. Yes.
Yeah.
Gather round.
But so any final thoughts on Deadly Weapon? I like I said, I feel like we are the definitive. So I keep saying this, and I'm going to look, and there's going to be like 500 podcast episodes on this, and I'm going to have to eat my words, but I'm okay with that. I feel like we're the definitive source on this movie to this point, though, because I don't really feel like it's being explored. So I thought there was stuff about it that I liked. I don't know if the fact that it is sort of an unpleasant movie with what it's about makes it kind of contrast negatively to LASERBLAST. I think LASERBLAST is silly, and has little Dave Allen effects and stuff, and Eddie Deason and some silliness in it, which I think maybe is welcome. Maybe this one is a little bit too self-serious, but that being said, I wouldn't mind if it were restored and presented in a way that you was able to track down.
Yeah.
What about you, Steve?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating relic, if nothing else. Like I wish it picked a lane a little bit. I wish it kind of settled on a thesis statement that was a little clearer, because there's a lot of interesting ideas floating around in this movie, but ultimately I was just kind of not really sure where to stand with it, and it is really nasty and really kind of off-putting in a way I was not expecting.
Yeah.
The ending is
Mike, what about you?
The ending is so depressing. It's a bummer, and you're not clear whether it was a dream. Clearly he's dead. And after all he's been through, and we see his dog get killed and his dad beat him up and these bullies attack him, you're really on his side, and it just doesn't work out for him. I know it doesn't work out for the kid in LASERBLAST either, right? If I recall correctly, that's just, I mean, if
he just like falls apart.
Falls apart. But that's, like you said, Jared, that's silly. And this feels more real at the end. The last shot of the movie feels more real than anything that came in the first, 70 minutes with that reporter out in front of the cafe with the police tape on it, and it's sad, and it just leaves you on. I don't know if I'd ever want to. I don't know if I want to watch that again. I want to see a new ending. I want an ending where Zeke goes off to the mothership for real, and or he wakes up. It's just, it's a dark movie. It's a lot darker than you would think.
Yeah.
Well, this movie has something that, I don't know, maybe we'll adopt this as kind of an editing or transition trick, which is every time a new character starts talking, there's kind of this hilarious like guitar shredding.
Oh yeah.
Which I almost I thought about when I was doing my intro before Steve started talking to try to have that queued up and play. And I figured that was a little more work than I was willing to do for this, but it's kind of funny. It happens multiple times where it's just like there's a break between a transition of a scene or characters talking, and it's just this like very loud and in your face. It's almost like Poochie's playing guitar.
Yeah. They need to Rossify that by like 20%.
Very teen afternoon TV. There, when the movie, it kind of makes the movie look a little bit like a gum commercial from the 80s.
Yeah.
It's a fruit by the foot commercial.
Well, Michael, it was great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me
about this deeply weird movie with us. You have this exciting book coming out. Please tell us about it.
That's right. So what we've done, Icons of Fright, we ran that for about 20 years, and then we just took the site offline a couple of years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago. We have 20 years of long form interviews with horror icons. Some are still with us, some aren't. It goes all the way back to like Betsy Palmer. We talked to Ben Chapman from Creature from the Black Lagoon. We talked to Oz Perkins. We talked to Oz Perkins when he was an actor. So, and what we wanted to do is, we were watching so many websites collapse and all this content just vanishes and disappears. And we wanted to see what we could do to preserve it. So me and my partner on the website thought about, maybe we could self-publish a book. We approached Dustin McNeil from Harker Press, who's put out a lot of phenomenal books. Two standouts are Taking Shape and Taking Shape 2 about the making of Halloween and the unmade sequels to Halloween.
Taking Shape 2 is one of my favorite books.
It's fantastic. It's outstanding. Awesome. He also just published, he published a book on Wes Craven called The Soul of Wes Craven. That's a beautiful, almost academic breakdown of Wes Craven's career. It's essential. So we approached him for advice on how we could go about that. And Dustin said, well, I want to publish, I'll publish your work. We'll work together on it. So we've been working together on it. We're compiling 100 of what we think is of our best works, and we're working on including some new stuff. So we just did our first long form Icons of Fright interview in about 15 years. Last week we brought Parker Finn from the Smile movies, and so he'll be in the book. There'll definitely be some Full Moon Charlie Band people in there. William Butler for one. We have a fantastic interview with him from back in the days. And I anticipate a release sometime in the second half of 2025 this year as well. So look forward to it. I'm looking forward to preserving this work that we did, and it's really just, it's for us, but I hope everybody likes looking back on it.
Amazing. I mean, that sounds incredible. It sounds like it's going to be a treasure trove of these interviews with these amazing horror icons. So I can't wait. I can't wait for those.
Yeah.
And
it has been hard.
If people want to follow up with you about the book and stuff like that, can they find you on the internet?
I'm on Instagram at life at 24 FPS. Or just Mike Cucinotta on Instagram. Icons of Fright's not live anymore. We're going to bring that back closer to the publication of the book. I'm also I've left X. It's a cesspool, but I am on. I just joined Blue. Oh, it's terrible, horrible. I'm on Blue Sky now. Michael W. Cucinotta, Mike WC at Blue Sky, whatever the Blue Sky thing is. I'll be there, and I'll be posting there from now on. I had to get away from X. So
yeah. Good choice. Good choice. Everybody's mental health benefited a little bit when they
Yeah.
delete that stupid bird.
Oh,
It's not
I
even.
don't
It's
wanna
not
be
even
angry
a
all the time
bird
anymore.
any longer.
Yeah.
It's just gone.
No. But yeah, if you check out Mike's stuff there and keep up with the book, I'm sure they're going to put out something that you love. If you like what we do, you can jump onto Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leave us a little 5-star rating, maybe a brief review as well, if you feel so inclined to do so. You can follow us primarily on Instagram at puppetmasters_castle freaks. You can follow me at _Giallo_Jared or Steve at Minotaur Matador. You can also email us at puppetmasterscastlefreaks@gmail.com, like this person named Tom did a few weeks ago for us. So we've got a fun little email here that I would just like to take the opportunity to read out loud. It says, "Hey guys, just wanted to reach out to say hi and compliment the show." Thank you, Tom.
Thank
It's
you.
an impressive project, and I've got a lot of respect for what you're doing. Yeah, I feel like that it's going to get tiresome after a while. Luckily, it has not to this point. I discovered it a couple weeks ago while I was revisiting Subspecies, a favorite from my youth, and you guys ended up sending me on a big full moon kick. I'm around your age and was a video store kid too, but there's so much I haven't seen yet. It's been great watching random full moon movies and then looking up your episode to see what you guys have to say about it. I also appreciate all the background on Empire Band, etc., which is fascinating stuff. I heard you guys mention that you also like Italian horror, and that's probably me more so, but I know I do say that quite a bit on mic. So I wanted to pass along a project I've been putting out. It's a video essay series called Goth Renaissance, covering the first wave of Italian horror from the 1960s, Bava, Freda, Barbara Steele, all that stuff. The final chapter is up, which ties things together and shows how the early Italian Gothics pointed the way toward later stages of Italian exploitation films of the 70s and 80s. If you're interested in checking it out, I can speak for myself when I say I am interested in checking it out, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners will as well. So definitely, if you want to reach out to us and give us feedback on the show and tell us some stories and stuff, definitely do not hesitate to email us. But we're not the only show that Steve puts all of this hard work into. Steve, what else have you got going on?
Well, I'm also the host of a show called Cinema Arcade. That's cinema and arcade mashed together. That is what we do on that show. We watch a movie and then play a video game based on that movie to see how it contrasts, compares, detracts, improves, lots of different things. We have lots of interesting stuff out there right now. Recently wrapped an episode on Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, a deeply, deeply weird movie and a pretty fantastic video game. And we've got stuff coming up for the holiday season. It's going to be a lot of fun. At this time, it's in the past of when you're listening to this. But hey, we've got some stuff coming up. It's going to be a lot of fun. So check it out. And check us out next week because we have a fun one. We are going back to the family-friendly Moonbeam territory with a film from 1993 called Remote. Sort of a wacky Home Alone-esque adventure of a kid taking on some bumbling burglars with a lot of remote control toys. So going to be a lot of fun on that one. So definitely check out Remote next week.
All right. Well, thank you again to Mike Cucinotta for joining us to talk about the very weird and still sort of up in the air, I suppose, movie Deadly Weapon. And we will see all of you next time.